March 6, 1944, 28,000 feet above Berlin, Germany. Hauptmann Klaus Mitusch pulled his Messerschmitt Bauhaus 109 G6 into a gentle banking turn. The familiar skyline of the German capital spread out below him like a detailed map. The morning sun glinted off the Spree River as it wound through the heart of the Reich. For 3 years this had been sanctuary. Home airspace, the one place where Luftwaffe pilots could intercept Allied bombers without worrying about enemy fighters following them deep into Germany. Mitusch keyed his radio, his voice crackling through the static to his wingman. "Hans, looks like another milk run today. The Amis will turn back soon enough." He was referring to the American bomber formations that had been detected crossing into German airspace an hour earlier. By now their escort fighters would be running low on fuel, forced to abandon the bombers somewhere over western Germany and limp back to England. It was the natural order of things in 1944. A mathematical certainty that had governed air combat over Europe for years. The physics were simple and unforgiving. Even the longest-range American escort fighter, the P-47 Thunderbolt, could only penetrate about 30-75 miles into German territory before fuel considerations forced it to turn back. Berlin lay 500 miles from the English coast. For the Luftwaffe, this created what they called the fighter gap, a deadly zone where American bombers flew naked and vulnerable, stripped of their protective escorts. Oberst Gunther Rau, the legendary ace with over 250 victories, had briefed his pilots on this exact scenario countless times at Duberitz airfield, just outside Berlin. "Gentlemen," he would say, tapping the wall map with his pointer, "patience is our weapon. Let the Americans exhaust their fuel fighting our forward units. By the time they reach the capital, they'll be alone." This strategy had worked with devastating effectiveness. When the 8th Air Force had launched their first daylight raid on Berlin in March 1943, they lost 69 bombers in a single day, a catastrophic 26% loss rate that nearly ended daylight bombing altogether. The Luftwaffe had simply waited, conserving their strength until the escorts turned back, then fallen upon the defenseless bombers like wolves on a wounded deer. Below Mitusch's fighter, Berlin's anti-aircraft defenses stood ready in their familiar pattern. The massive flak towers jutted skyward like concrete mountains, their 128mm guns capable of throwing deadly steel fragments to altitudes of 35,000 feet. Ring after ring of lighter 88mm and 37mm guns surrounded the city in concentric circles. On clear days like this, when visibility stretched for miles, the flak gunners could see approaching formations long before they reached the city center. But it wasn't just the guns that made Berlin a fortress. The city was surrounded by a constellation of fighter airfields: Duberitz, Rangsdorf, Gatow, Staaken, each one home to squadrons of seasoned pilots flying the latest variants of the Messerschmitt. These men had cut their teeth in the skies over Britain during the Blitz, had learned their deadly trade in the crucible of the Eastern Front, and had spent 3 years perfecting the art of bomber interception over the Reich. Mitusch himself was one of these veterans. At 24 he already had 37 kills to his name, most of them American heavy bombers. He knew every trick, every weakness of the big four-engine fortresses and Liberator. He knew that the B-17's blind spot was directly beneath the tail, that the B-24's wing tanks would explode spectacularly if hit in just the right place, that bomber gunners were most accurate at ranges between 2. The morning radio chatter from the forward warning stations painted a familiar picture. Large formation estimated 200 bombers, approaching from the northwest, fighter escort present but thin. This was the standard pattern. A massive formation of American heavy bombers, protected by a swarm of P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, that would gradually peel away as fuel ran low. Mitusch glanced at his fuel gauge. Full tank. His 109 carried enough fuel for nearly 3 hours of flight time, more than sufficient for multiple attack runs on the incoming bombers once their escorts departed. The ammunition counter showed 200 rounds for his single 30mm cannon, and 500 rounds for each of his twin 13. Enough firepower to bring down several bombers if his aim was true. The radio crackled again. "All units. Bandits now crossing the Elbe. Estimate 20 minutes to target. 20 minutes until the Americans reached Berlin's outer defensive ring. But more importantly, 10 minutes until their escort fighters would be forced to turn back, leaving the bombers exposed for the killing blow that would surely follow. It was a script that had played out dozens of times before over the Reich's capital. Soon, very soon, Klaus Mitusch and his fellow pilots would dive down from the safety of the German sky to claim their prey. What none of them could possibly imagine was that today, for the first time in the war, American escort fighters were about to shatter every assumption about range, endurance, and sanctuary that had kept Berlin safe for 3 long years. 6:47 a.m. March 6, 1944, RAF Debden, England. Lieutenant Colonel Don Blakesley stood beside his P-51B Mustang, watching the pre-dawn darkness slowly give way to gray morning light across the Essex countryside. The aircraft before him bore the distinctive checkered nose of the 4th Fighter Group, but it was what hung beneath the fighter's wings that made today different from every other escort mission of the war. 2 sleek, teardrop-shaped auxiliary fuel tanks flanked the Mustang's belly, each one containing 108 gallons of high-octane aviation fuel. Combined with the aircraft's internal fuel capacity, Blakesley's fighter now carried enough gasoline to stay airborne for over 8 hours. 8 hours, long enough to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. "Check your drop tank connections one more time," Blakesley called to his pilots as they conducted their final pre-flight inspections. "We're going farther than any escort fighter in history today. I don't want anyone running dry over the Reich." Captain Don Gentile, the group's leading ace, ran his hands along the fuel lines feeding his external tanks. The math was precise and unforgiving. Internal fuel would get them across the channel and deep into Germany. The drop tanks would carry them to Berlin, and careful fuel management on the return leg would barely get them home to England. There was no margin for error, no fuel for extended dogfighting, no reserve for weather delays. The mission briefing had been unlike any they'd received before. Instead of the usual penetration limit somewhere over western Germany, the red line on the wall map had stretched all the way across the Reich to the enemy capital itself. For the first time since America entered the war, heavy bombers would have fighter protection over the heart of Nazi Germany. Major Pierce McKinnon, the group's intelligence officer, had laid out the stark reality during the 0400 hours briefing. "Gentlemen, this is what we've been working toward. The Merlin engine and these new drop tanks give us the range we've never had before. But understand, the Germans don't know we're coming. They've never seen American fighters over Berlin. When you show up, you're going to catch them completely by surprise." The transformation of the P-51 from a mediocre performer to the war's premier escort fighter had been nothing short of revolutionary. Originally designed with an American Allison engine, the Mustang had been relegated to low-altitude reconnaissance and ground attack roles. But when British engineers mated the airframe to the Rolls-Royce Merlin V12, the same engine that powered the legendary Spitfire, everything changed. The Merlin-powered P-51B could cruise at 27.5 miles at 25,000 feet while burning only 65 gallons of fuel per hour. No other fighter in the world combined such speed with such efficiency. Where a P-47 Thunderbolt consumed 100 gallons per hour and had an operational radius of 75 miles, the P-51 could fly 6 fight over the target and return home with fuel to spare. Lieutenant Robert Peterson, fresh from flight training in Texas, stood beside his brand new Mustang and tried to comprehend the magnitude of what they were about to attempt. "Skipper," he called to Blakesley, "what if the Germans don't believe? What if they think we're some new German fighters they haven't seen before?" Blakesley smiled grimly as he pulled on his leather flight jacket. "Bob, when they see those white stars on our wings over their capital city, they'll believe it real quick." At 07:15 hours, the first P-51s began starting their engines. The sound was distinctive, the deep, throaty rumble of the Merlin V12 that was both music and threat. One by one, 48 Mustangs of the 4th Fighter Group fired up their engines and began taxiing toward the active runway. Behind them, other fighter groups across East Anglia were conducting identical procedures. The 35 4th Fighter Group from Boxted, the 35 7th from Leiston, the 3063rd from Rivenhall, in total nearly 200 P-51 Mustangs preparing for the deepest penetration mission in the history of air warfare. The bombers had already departed, wave after wave of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators climbing into the dawn sky, their contrails painting white streaks across the English countryside. Today's target was a complex of ball-bearing factories in Berlin, industrial facilities crucial to the German war machine. But the real target, the strategic objective that mattered more than any factory, was the Luftwaffe itself. General James Doolittle, commander of the 8th Air Force, had made the mission clear in his directive to the fighter groups. Your job is not merely to escort bombers. Your job is to destroy the German Air Force. Go out and find them, fight them, beat them. As Blakesley's Mustang reached the runway threshold, he keyed his radio one final time. Horseback leader to all horseback aircraft. Today we're going to show the Luftwaffe something they've never seen before. American fighters over Berlin. Stay tight, watch your fuel, and remember, we own the sky now. The P-51's Merlin engine roared to full power, and Don Blakesley released the brakes. The Mustang, heavy with fuel and purpose, accelerated down the runway and lifted into the gray English morning. Behind him, 47 more fighters followed in quick succession, each one carrying enough fuel to reach the German capital and the firepower to dominate the sky when they arrived. None of the American pilots could know that 500 miles away, Klaus Mitusch and his fellow Luftwaffe pilots were conducting their routine morning patrols, secure in the knowledge that Berlin remained beyond the reach of enemy fighters. That mathematical certainty, that fundamental assumption upon which German defensive strategy had been built, was about to be shattered forever. The long reach of American air power was finally extending all the way to the heart of the Reich. 11:23 a.m., March 6, 1944. 26,000 feet above Berlin, Germany. Hauptmann Klaus Mitusch squinted through his armored windscreen as the first formations of American bombers appeared as dark specks on the northwestern horizon. Right on schedule, the morning sun illuminated the distinctive silhouettes of B-17 flying fortresses, their 4 engines trailing thin contrails across the crystal-clear sky above the German capital. But something was wrong. Mitusch blinked hard and looked again. Surrounding the bomber formations, maintaining perfect tactical spacing, were smaller aircraft that his experienced eye immediately recognized as single-engine fighters. His breath caught in his throat. American fighters. Over Berlin. Das ist unmöglich, he whispered into his oxygen mask. Impossible. The radio frequency exploded with confused German voices as other pilots spotted the same impossible sight. Control, this is Yellow 4. I'm seeing escort fighters with the bombers. Single-engine, inline engines. They look like Mustangs. The response from ground control came back sharp and incredulous. Yellow 4, confirm your sighting. Repeat. Confirm escort fighters over Berlin. Confirmed. American fighters, bearing 290. Altitude 26,000. At least 30 contacts. Lieutenant Colonel Don Blakesley held his P-51B in perfect formation with the lead bomber group, his eyes constantly scanning the sky for the German interceptors he knew must be positioning for attack. The flight from England had been flawless, a steady climb across the channel, navigation checkpoints hit precisely on time, fuel consumption exactly as calculated. The external drop tanks had been jettisoned over western Germany. Their job done, leaving the Mustangs clean and deadly over the Reich's capital. Horseback leader. Bandits at 2 o'clock high, called Captain Don Gentile. Looks like 10 or 9s. About a dozen of them. Blakesley spotted them immediately. A formation of Messerschmitt fighters beginning their attack run on the bombers. But something was different about their approach. Instead of the confident, aggressive diving attacks he'd seen from German pilots over France and the Low Countries, these fighters seemed hesitant, almost confused. The reason became clear over the German radio frequencies that American intelligence would intercept and translate hours later. Oberfeldwebel Heinrich Storm, a veteran pilot with 43 kills, found himself unable to process what his eyes were telling him. This cannot be real, Storm radioed to his squadron leader. Those are definitely American fighters, but we're over Berlin. How is this possible? Where did they get the range? The tactical situation that had governed air combat over Germany for 3 years had just been turned upside down. German fighter tactics were built around the assumption that American escorts would be long gone by the time bombers reached central Germany. Luftwaffe pilots were trained to attack from high altitude, diving through the bomber formations with guns blazing, secure in the knowledge that no enemy fighters would be there to interfere. But now, for the first time in the war, Messerschmitt 1009s found themselves facing Mustangs in a fair fight over their own capital city. Major Günther Rahl leading a formation of 16 Focke-Wulf 90s from Duberitz airfield had never encountered anything like this in 4 years of combat. His fighters were positioned perfectly for a classic bomber interception, high, fast, and aggressive. But as his formation rolled into their attack dive, American fighters immediately turned to engage them. Break, break. Mustangs attacking from high point. Rahl's voice cut through the radio static as he threw his Focke-Wulf into a violent evasive maneuver. The carefully planned interception dissolved into a wild dogfight as German and American fighters tangled at 25,000 feet directly above the Nazi capital. Lieutenant Robert Peterson, the young pilot from Texas flying his first mission over Berlin, found himself in a climbing turn with a Messerschmitt 1009, both aircraft pulling maximum Gs as they spiraled upward in a deadly dance. The German pilot was good, very good, but Peterson could see confusion in his opponent's tactics. The Luftwaffe pilot kept breaking off attacks and looking around as if he couldn't believe where he was fighting. "This guy's spooked," Peterson radioed to his flight leader. "He's flying like he's seen a ghost." In many ways he had. Klaus Mitusch, now engaged in a turning fight with Don Gentile's Mustang, found his mind reeling with the implications of what was happening. If American fighters could reach Berlin, they could reach anywhere in Germany. Every Luftwaffe airfield, every aircraft factory, every training base was now within range of enemy escort fighters. The sanctuary was broken. As Mitusch rolled his 1009 to follow Gentile's P-51 in a climbing spiral, he keyed his radio to squadron frequency. All aircraft. All aircraft. This changes everything. If they can reach Berlin." His transmission was cut short as Gentile's Mustang snap-rolled and came around in a firing position, forcing Mitusch into desperate evasive maneuver. Below them, the bomber formations continued their steady approach to the target, their defensive fire creating black puffs of smoke across the sky. But for the first time over Berlin, the bombers were not alone. American fighters swarmed around them like protective wasps, turning every German interception attempt into a life-or-death struggle. Oberst Werner Mulders, monitoring the battle from the ground control bunker beneath Berlin's Tiergarten, listened to the increasingly frantic radio reports with growing dread. His pilots weren't just reporting tactical defeats. They were reporting the collapse of fundamental assumptions that had governed German air defense strategy. "Sir," his radar operator called out, "we're tracking at least 50 American fighters over the city. Range from our bases indicates they still have fuel for extended combat." Mulders stared at the plotting board in stunned silence. The mathematics of air warfare, which had protected Berlin for 3 years, had just been rewritten by American engineering and determination. The fighter gap that had made the German capital a safe haven no longer existed. High above the city, the dogfights continued with desperate intensity, but the outcome was already clear. The age of Luftwaffe's sanctuary over Germany was ending in the skies above Berlin, marked by the contrails of Mustangs that should not have existed in this place at this time with this devastating capability. 11:31 a.m. March 6, 1944, 24,000 feet above the Brandenburg Gate. Klaus Mitusch pulled his Messerschmitt into a vertical climb, his engine screaming at full military power as he tried to gain altitude advantage over Don Gentile's pursuing Mustang. The irony was not lost on him. He was fighting for his life in the skies above his own capital, something that was supposed to be impossible. Below them, the familiar landmarks of Berlin spread out like a detailed model. The Brandenburg Gate, the Chancellery, The Tiergarten where he had walked as a child, all of it now a battlefield where American and German fighters wrote contrails of death across the morning sky. Gentile's P-51 stayed with him through the climb, the Merlin engine's supercharger giving it performance that matched the Messerschmitt at altitude. As both aircraft reached 26,000 feet, their climb rates began to falter and Mitish made his decision. He snap-rolled inverted and pulled through into a split S maneuver, diving vertically toward the city below. The Mustang followed. What Mitish couldn't know was that Don Gentile had been waiting for exactly this moment. The American ace had studied German tactics extensively, and he knew that Luftwaffe pilots often used vertical maneuvers to escape when conventional turning fights weren't working. As the two fighters plummeted toward Berlin in a deadly race, Gentile began closing the distance. At 15,000 feet, Mitish pulled out of his dive and immediately threw his aircraft into a series of violent barrel rolls, trying to throw off his pursuer's aim. But the P-51 stayed locked onto him, and suddenly Mitish felt the hammering impact of .50 caliber bullets striking his aircraft. The first burst shattered his canopy and punched holes through his port wing. The second burst found his engine and black smoke began streaming from the Daimler-Benz DB605 as coolant lines ruptured. Mitish's fighter, moments before a deadly predator over his homeland, had become a wounded bird limping for survival. "Mayday, mayday." He radioed, switching to the emergency frequency. "This is Yellow 1. I'm hit and going down." American fighter aircraft over Berlin. Repeat. American fighters over the capital. 3 miles away, Lieutenant Robert Peterson was discovering what combat veterans had known for years, that air warfare over your enemy's homeland was far different from fighting over neutral territory. As he pursued a Focke-Wulf 90 in a turning fight above the Spree River, Peterson could see the city's massive flak towers training their guns skyward. Suddenly the sky around him erupted in black bursts of heavy anti-aircraft fire. The German flak gunners, unable to distinguish between friend and foe in the swirling dogfight, were firing at everything that moved. Peterson watched in fascination and horror as an 88mm shell exploded directly between his Mustang and the Focke-Wulf he was chasing. The German pilot Oberfeldwebel Franz Stiegler used the flak barrage as cover to break off the engagement and head for the deck. As his FW-190 dove toward Berlin's suburbs, Stiegler's mind raced with the implications of what he had just experienced. Not only were American fighters over Berlin, but they were fighting so aggressively that German anti-aircraft guns were firing on the entire battle. "Control, this is Red 7, Stiegler radioed as he leveled off at 8,000 feet. "The Americans are not just escorting. They're hunting us. They're fighting like they own the sky over Berlin." The response from ground control carried a note of barely controlled panic. All units, priority override. American escort fighters are engaging our interceptors over the capital." Repeat. "We have American fighters with extended range capability engaging over Berlin." In the Luftwaffe command bunker beneath the city, the full magnitude of the strategic disaster was becoming clear to Oberst Werner Mulders and his staff. The plotting boards showed American fighters operating at full combat effectiveness 500 miles from their bases, a capability that German intelligence had deemed impossible. "Sir," reported Major Karl Heinz, the operations officer, "if they can reach Berlin with enough fuel for extended combat, they can reach any target in the Reich. Hamburg, Munich, the Ruhr, nowhere is beyond their range now." Mulders studied the tactical display with the cold calculation of a professional warrior. Red symbols marked German aircraft. Blue symbols showed American formations. For the first time in the war, there were more blue symbols than red over a German target. The numerical advantage that had been the Luftwaffe's greatest asset in homeland defense was evaporating before his eyes. But it wasn't just the numbers. The radio reports flooding in from his pilots told a story of psychological shock that was perhaps more damaging than the tactical defeat. These were veteran airmen, aces with dozens of kills, men who had dominated the skies over Europe for years. Now they were fighting desperately for survival over their own capital city. High above the battle, Lieutenant Colonel Don Blakesley maintained his position with the bomber formations while monitoring the radio chatter from his scattered fighters. The bombers were approaching their target, the ball-bearing factories in the southern suburbs of Berlin. But that was almost secondary now. The real mission, The destruction of German air power was happening all around him. Horseback leader. This is Horseback 3, came Don Gentile's voice over the radio. Splash 1. The pilot bailed out over the city center. Klaus Mietisch's parachute had opened just in time, carrying him down toward a Berlin street he had known since childhood. As he drifted toward the rooftops, he looked up to see American fighters still circling overhead, still engaged in combat with his surviving squadron mates. The sight was surreal. Enemy aircraft dominating the sky above the heart of the thousand-year. When Mietisch's boots touched German soil in a bombed-out courtyard near Potsdamer Platz, he was immediately surrounded by Berliners who had witnessed his parachute descent. Their faces showed the same shock and disbelief that he felt. "Herr Hauptmann," asked an elderly man, his voice barely above a whisper, "how did the Americans get fighters all the way to Berlin?" Mietisch, still tangled in his parachute lines, could only shake his head. "I don't know," he replied honestly, "but if they can reach Berlin, they can reach anywhere." Above them, the dogfights continued, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. American Mustangs, freed from the range limitations that had protected German airspace for 3 years, were systematically dismantling Luftwaffe formations over the Reich's capital. The mathematical certainty of the fighter gap had been replaced by a new equation, one that promised American air superiority anywhere their bombers chose to fly. The sanctuary of Berlin, protected by distance and fuel limitations since 1941, had fallen not to bombs or artillery but to engineering genius and strategic vision. The Merlin engine and auxiliary fuel tanks had done what armies could not. They had brought American air power to the heart of Nazi Germany. 12:15 p.m. March 6, 1944. 28,000 feet above Berlin outbound. Lieutenant Colonel Don Blakesley checked his fuel gauge as his P-51B Mustang climbed away from the German capital. The needle showed just enough fuel for the return flight to England. If he flew a perfect profile and encountered no headwinds, behind him smoke columns rose from the ball-bearing factories that the bombers had successfully attacked. But more importantly, German fighter formations were scattered and broken across the Berlin sky. "Horseback leader to all horseback aircraft," Blakesley radioed. "Form up for withdrawal. Check your fuel states and stay tight." As his fighters gradually assembled into formation, he could see the contrails of other American fighter groups conducting similar departures from different vectors around the city. The mission had been a complete success, not just tactically but strategically. Below them, in the Luftwaffe command bunker, Oberst Werner Mölders was conducting a grim assessment with his staff. The morning's battle had cost them 12 fighters destroyed and 9 pilots killed or wounded. But the numbers didn't tell the real story. The psychological impact on his remaining pilots was devastating. "Sir," reported Major Karl Heinz, reading from a sheaf of after-action reports, "the pilots are asking how we're supposed to defend against something we were told was impossible. Squadron leaders are requesting immediate briefings on American fighter capabilities." Mölders stared at the tactical map where red pins marked the locations of downed German aircraft, all of them over or near Berlin. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "we just witnessed the end of our defensive strategy. If American fighters can reach Berlin with fuel to fight, then every target in the Reich is now vulnerable to escorted bombing raids." The implications were staggering. German aircraft production facilities in Bavaria, submarine pens in Hamburg, synthetic fuel plants in the Ruhr Valley. All of them had been protected by their distance from Allied bases. That protection no longer existed. At 28,000 feet, Captain Don Gentile was experiencing a different kind of revelation. As Berlin fell away beneath his wings, he realized that this mission represented more than just extended range. It marked the moment when American air power achieved true strategic reach. The Luftwaffe, which had terrorized Europe for 5 years, was now vulnerable everywhere. "Don," came Lieutenant Peterson's voice over the radio. "What happens next? If we can hit Berlin, where can't we go?" The answer was nowhere. The P-51 Mustang, with its combination of speed, range, and firepower, had fundamentally altered the strategic balance of the air war. German pilots, who had grown accustomed to fighting on their own terms in their own airspace, would now face American fighters wherever bombers chose to strike. 300 miles away, at RAF Debden, Intelligence officers were already analyzing the early radio intercepts from the Berlin mission. Flight Lieutenant James Morrison, a former Cambridge linguistics professor now serving in RAF intelligence, listened to recorded German radio transmissions with growing excitement. "My God," he told his American counterpart Major William Hayes from 8th Air Force Intelligence. "Listen to this intercept. A German squadron leader is asking his ground control how American fighters got enough range to reach Berlin. They genuinely didn't believe it was possible." The psychological dimension of the victory was as important as the tactical success. For 3 years, Luftwaffe pilots had enjoyed the confidence that came from fighting in defended airspace, knowing that enemy fighters couldn't follow them home. That confidence was now shattered, replaced by the knowledge that nowhere in the Reich was beyond American reach. As the P-51s crossed the German border heading west, they left behind a transformed strategic situation. Klaus Mietusch, now being debriefed by Luftwaffe intelligence officers in Berlin, struggled to explain what he had witnessed. The Americans weren't just escorting bombers, he told Oberst Hans Philipp, his wing commander. They were hunting, fighting as aggressively over Berlin as we would fight over London. Their range capability changes everything. Philipp, himself an ace with 206 victories, understood immediately. "Klaus, if they can reach Berlin with full combat capability, we're no longer fighting a defensive war in our own airspace. We're fighting for survival." The ripple effects of March 6, 1944 would transform the air war over Europe. Within weeks, American bombers escorted by P-51 Mustangs would be striking targets across the length and breadth of Germany. Oil refineries, aircraft factories, transportation hubs, all would come under sustained attack by formations that no longer had to worry about the fighter gap that had protected them. For the Luftwaffe, the appearance of Mustangs over Berlin marked the beginning of a death spiral. Forced to defend everywhere, they could defend nowhere effectively. German fighter pilots, already outnumbered and facing fuel shortages, now had to fight American escorts that could follow them anywhere in the Reich. By sunset on March 6th, as Don Blakesley's Mustang touched down on the runway at RAF Debden, the strategic equation of World War II had been permanently altered. The mission clock showed 7 hours and 20 minutes of flight time, longer than any escort mission in aviation history. But more than that, it showed that American industrial might, engineering innovation and pilot skill had combined to project air power across an entire continent. The Merlin engine that powered the P-51, originally developed by Rolls-Royce for Britain's defense, had become the instrument of Germany's aerial defeat. As Blakesley climbed down from his cockpit, his crew chief asked the question that every airman at Debden wanted answered. "How'd it go, Colonel?" Blakesley pulled off his leather flying helmet and looked back toward the east, where the sun was setting over a Germany that would never again enjoy sanctuary from American air power. "It went perfectly," he replied. "We just ended their safe zone. From now on we can go anywhere they can go, and we can fight them when we get there." The age of American air supremacy over Europe had begun, marked by the sight that Klaus Mietusch and his fellow Luftwaffe pilots would never forget. The contrails of impossible American fighters riding victory across the sky above the heart of the Third Reich.